The moment you stop needing her is the exact moment she starts seeing you again. Neediness destroys respect, not love, because love can survive vulnerability, but respect cannot survive desperation. The moment someone senses that your emotional stability depends on their behavior, your position shifts from equal to dependent, and dependence quietly erodes how you are valued. It doesn't happen through insult or mockery at first. It happens through subtle shifts in tone, effort, and attention. Messages take longer to be answered. Boundaries become loose on one side and rigid on the other. What once felt mutual begins to feel conditional. Neediness communicates that you are afraid to lose, and fear rearranges the power dynamic without ever announcing itself. You start over-explaining, over-giving, over-forgiving, and constantly proving that you are worthy of staying chosen. None of this comes from love alone. It comes from fear dressed up as devotion. Love says, I choose you. Neediness says, I am nothing if you leave. And the mind does not honor what it feels responsible for carrying. The other person doesn't wake up one day intending to lose respect. It happens gradually as they realize your limits are negotiable and your standards are flexible when abandonment feels close. The more you tolerate what hurts you just to preserve connection, the more the connection loses its balance, and what remains looks like loyalty on the surface, but insecurity underneath. True love is strengthened by freedom, not by captivity. When someone stays because they want to, it deepens connection. When they stay because they feel guilty, pressured, or responsible for your emotional survival, respect suffocates. Neediness turns every disagreement into a threat, every silence into panic, and every boundary into rejection. You stop responding and start reacting. You listen not to understand, but to prevent loss. You compromise not because it aligns with your values, but because you are terrified of being alone. And the tragedy of neediness is that it teaches the other person how much they can take without consequence. It trains them to believe that your standards collapse under emotional pressure. It whispers to them that they are the prize and you are the pursuer, the chooser and the chosen, the source of meaning and the one seeking meaning. Respect requires tension, individuality, and self-containment. It requires the sense that the other person has a full life, full worth, and full identity that does not collapse in your absence. When you abandon yourself emotionally to hold on to someone, you may preserve proximity for a while, but you lose authority over how you are treated. That is why neediness feels exhausting to carry and uncomfortable to witness. It pulls instead of invites. It rushes instead of allows. It seeks reassurance instead of standing in certainty. Love can coexist with longing, but respect cannot survive the constant broadcast of, I need you more than I need myself. The moment your self-worth becomes negotiable, the rules of the relationship quietly change, and what you once exchanged as equals gradually turns into reassurance on one side and expectation on the other, attention on one side and entitlement on the other, effort on one side and distance on the other, until the imbalance becomes normal and the loss of respect becomes invisible because it happens so slowly. You only feel it in how everything now feels heavier than it once did, and how you now work harder for what used to come naturally, and how you now give more just to receive less, and how you now exist in a relationship that still has love in it, but no longer carries the weight of honor, curiosity, or awe that once made it feel alive and steady and chosen, rather than held together by quiet fear of being left and the constant need to make yourself easier to keep than to truly value. Detachment is self-respect, not emotional coldness, because it does not come from a lack of feeling, but from the ability to hold your feelings without letting them rule your dignity. Detachment is what happens when you finally understand that loving deeply does not require losing yourself in the process. It is the quiet line you draw between what you feel and what you tolerate. Emotional coldness is withdrawal without awareness, but detachment is awareness with control. It is the moment you stop reacting from fear and start responding from clarity. When you detach, you are not shutting down your heart. You are removing desperation from your decisions. You are no longer driven by anxiety, anticipation, or the constant need for validation. You stop checking your worth through someone else's mood, availability, or approval. You stop bending your identity into whatever shape is easiest to keep someone close. You still care, but you no longer cling. You still love, but you no longer collapse. Detachment teaches you that love should be an addition to your life, not a substitute for your purpose, your values, or your self-esteem. And when you begin to live from that place, your energy changes. You speak less, but with more weight. You explain less, but with more certainty. You no longer need to convince anyone of your value because you are no longer questioning it yourself. What most people mistake for coldness is actually the strength it takes to remain steady when powerful emotions are present. A detached person still feels disappointment, still feels longing, still feels hurt, but they do not surrender control of their behavior to those feelings. They do not chase clarity at the cost of their pride. They do not beg for reassurance at the expense of their peace. They allow silence without panic. They allow space without suspicion. They allow uncertainty without unraveling. Detachment is the ability to sit with unanswered questions and unresolved emotions without self-betrayal. It is choosing not to fight every battle just to be seen. It is trusting that what is meant to stay will not require you to shrink yourself to keep it. Emotional coldness pushes people away out of numbness. Detachment allows closeness without dependency. It says, I want you, but I will not lose myself to keep you. It creates a relationship where love is chosen freely instead of clung to desperately. It removes emotional volatility from the dynamic and replaces it with stability. And stability is not boring, it is rare. It is the ground on which trust grows. When you detach, you become less reactive and more grounded. You stop interpreting every delay as rejection and every shift as abandonment. You begin to see people as they are rather than as threats to your emotional survival. You stop turning connection into conflict and love into a battlefield where every silence is a weapon and every disagreement feels like a breakup in disguise. And in that space of inner stillness, you remain fully capable of love without being consumed by it, open without being exposed, present without being possessed, strong without being hardened, allowing emotions to pass through you without letting them define your worth or dictate your behavior or rewrite your sense of self, while you stand rooted in who you are, regardless of who stays or who leaves. A man who can walk away cannot be controlled, because control only works where fear of loss exists. The moment a man becomes more afraid of being alone than of being disrespected, he hands over the authority of his life to whoever can threaten his attachment. Control thrives on emotional dependency, on the quiet belief that survival is tied to approval, closeness, or validation from another person. When a man loses the ability to leave, he also loses the ability to choose. And what was once a relationship becomes an arrangement driven by anxiety rather than intention. The power dynamic shifts silently at first, not through dramatic demands, but through small compromises that grow larger over time. He tolerates behavior he once would have questioned. He explains himself when no explanation is required. He negotiates his boundaries because he is afraid of consequences that feel heavier than his discomfort. And slowly, without ever being formally agreed upon, he teaches others that his presence is guaranteed no matter how he is treated. The man who cannot walk away can be persuaded, pressured, guilted, and manipulated because his fear speaks louder than his values. But the man who can walk away operates from a different center. His decisions are not dictated by panic. His silence is not weakness. His stillness is not confusion. He stays only where respect is mutual and effort is balanced. And that alone makes him uncontrollable because no one holds leverage over his identity or his peace. Walking away does not mean emotional numbness or indifference. It means emotional sovereignty. It means being attached without being trapped. A man who can walk away has already made peace with solitude, and that terrifies systems built on emotional bargaining. When someone knows you will not tolerate manipulation, inconsistency, or disrespect just to maintain connection, they approach you differently. They speak more carefully. They act more honestly. They test less and respect more because they sense that you are not operating from fear. Control only works when someone believes they have something to lose that they cannot replace. But the man who can walk away understands that his dignity is irreplaceable and that no relationship is worth the price of self-abandonment. He does not bluff with his boundaries. When he says he will leave, he means it, not as punishment, but as alignment. His power is not loud, it is quiet and unshakable. He does not need to chase compliance or demand loyalty because his absence carries more clarity than his arguments ever could. He becomes uncontrollable not because he dominates others, but because he governs himself. He is not driven by the hunger to be chosen at any cost. He is driven by the refusal to betray his values for comfort. That inner independence changes every interaction he enters. People either rise to meet his standard or fall away from his life. He does not beg for space, he creates it. He does not beg for honesty, he requires it through his willingness to disengage. He does not beg for effort. He matches what is freely given and withdraws when it is not. And because of that, he becomes a man who cannot be trapped by fear, cannot be owned by guilt, cannot be steered by emotional threats, cannot be shaken by withdrawal tactics, and cannot be controlled by anything that depends on his unwillingness to walk away. Silence carries more power than constant explanation because explanation often comes from insecurity, while silence comes from certainty. The need to constantly clarify, justify, defend, or prove yourself is rarely born from strength. It is born from the fear of being misunderstood, rejected, or abandoned. When you are secure in who you are and what you stand for, you do not feel the urgency to convince everyone of your truth. You allow your actions to speak, and actions move slower than words but land heavier. Constant explanation leaks energy. It teaches people that your boundaries are negotiable, that your decisions are open for debate, that your emotions require approval before they are valid. You begin to over-communicate not because the other person genuinely needs clarity, but because you are afraid their misunderstanding will cost you connection. Silence, on the other hand, does not scramble to be accepted. It does not rush to be understood. It does not beg to be seen. Silence holds its position without noise. It creates space for others to feel the weight of your absence, the consequence of their assumptions, and the discomfort of unanswered questions. When you stop explaining yourself to those who are committed to misunderstanding you, you quietly withdraw access to your inner world, and that withdrawal is felt more deeply than any argument ever could be. Explanation gives people something to push against. Silence gives them something to sit with. The more you explain, the more you invite resistance, debate, misinterpretation, and dismissal. You turn your truth into a negotiation instead of a statement. You begin defending things that never required defense and justifying things that never needed permission. Silence removes that battlefield entirely. It does not chase validation. It does not argue for recognition. It simply stands and allows reality to reveal itself without interference. In silence, people reveal their intentions, their insecurities, their motives. They show you how they interpret your absence, and in that interpretation, you learn more than you could ever learn from their words. Silence is not passivity, it is strategic restraint. It is the discipline to not say what feels urgent in the moment, so that what is important can become clear over time. It requires emotional control to stay quiet when ego wants to speak, when hurt wants to interrupt, when fear wants to demand reassurance. Silence does not mean you have nothing to say. It means you are choosing not to waste your truth on ears that are not ready to hear it. It is the difference between speaking from reaction and speaking from alignment. Constant explanation keeps you emotionally tangled in situations that should have already taught you what you needed to know. Silence untangles you without drama. It shifts the entire dynamic because you are no longer trying to manage how you are perceived. You allow others to interpret you through their own lens, and that lens exposes them far more than it defines you. Silence carries power because it does not rush to control the narrative. It allows the narrative to unfold. It allows people to confront the gap where your voice used to be, and in that gap, they feel your impact more intensely than they ever did when you were explaining yourself into exhaustion. And in that quiet space, your absence becomes more noticeable than your presence ever was. Your restraint becomes more unsettling than your arguments ever felt. Your composure becomes heavier than your defense, and your stillness begins to speak on your behalf, while you remain grounded in the knowledge that what is meant to understand you never required a performance or a justification or a carefully constructed explanation in the first place. Respect begins where fear of loss ends, because fear quietly places your worth into someone else's hands. The moment you become more terrified of losing a person than of losing yourself, the balance shifts from mutual regard to emotional dependence. Fear makes you shrink your boundaries before anyone even challenges them. It makes you tolerate what unsettles you, excuse what wounds you, and rationalize what slowly erodes your dignity. You call it patience, you call it understanding, you call it love, but beneath all of those softer words lives the raw anxiety of abandonment. When fear of loss runs the relationship, every decision becomes reactive. You say things to keep peace instead of to speak truth. You silence discomfort to avoid conflict. You replay conversations in your head, searching for the version of yourself that will be easiest to keep. And the more you operate from that place, the more you train the other person to see your limits as movable and your standards as flexible when pressure is applied. Respect cannot grow in a dynamic where one person is constantly bracing for departure. It requires the quiet confidence that you will survive even if someone chooses to leave. Not emotionally untouched, not unaffected, but intact enough to remain anchored in your values. Fear of loss does the opposite. It attaches your sense of safety to another person's behavior, moods, and decisions. And once that attachment is formed, your self-worth becomes something that can be withdrawn, delayed, negotiated, and disrupted from the outside. When the fear of loss ends, your posture in relationships changes without needing to announce itself. You stop over-explaining your needs because you no longer feel the urgency to justify your existence. You stop over-compromising because you no longer believe that agreement is the price of connection. You stop performing strength and begin embodying it quietly. The end of fear does not make you careless, it makes you grounded. You still care deeply, but you no longer beg to be chosen. You still invest, but you no longer hemorrhage yourself just to be kept close. People sense this shift immediately, not because you declare it, but because your energy no longer trembles around the possibility of loss. You become less reactive and more selective. You listen more carefully to behavior rather than to potential. You stop attaching to promises that have no follow-through. You stop returning to places where your worth must be negotiated. Respect enters the space the moment you are no longer willing to trade your peace for proximity. Not because you are cold, but because you are no longer afraid. The end of fear does not turn you into someone who expects perfection. It turns you into someone who requires consistency. It removes the desperation that once made you accept half presence as intimacy and crumbs as effort. It rewires the way others approach you because they no longer sense that they hold the power to destabilize your emotional ground. Respect begins when your life no longer pauses in anticipation of someone else's choices, when your happiness is no longer suspended in the waiting room of their uncertainty, when your sense of self is no longer braced against the threat of being left, when you no longer posture yourself as replaceable just to be kept, when the possibility of loss no longer governs your voice, your standards, your patience, and your willingness to walk away from what diminishes you, even when it still carries familiar comfort. Your worth rises the moment you stop chasing validation because the chase itself quietly announces that you doubt your own value. The need to be constantly seen, approved of, praised, chosen, or reassured teaches people that your self-image is negotiable and that your confidence is borrowed rather than owned. Validation seeking is not just about attention, it is about outsourcing your sense of enoughness to the reactions of others. Every compliment becomes a temporary fix. Every silence becomes a threat. Every delay becomes a question about your importance. You begin measuring yourself through external response instead of internal truth, and that is the moment your power starts leaking outward. The more you seek proof that you matter, the more you convince yourself that without that proof you don't. Worth that depends on applause collapses in quiet rooms. Worth that depends on approval fractures the moment it is withheld. When you stop chasing validation, you stop performing for acceptance. You stop adjusting your personality to be more palatable, more impressive, more desirable. You stop filtering your truth through the question of how it will be received. You begin to speak from alignment instead of approval seeking. And that shift is felt immediately, even if no one can name it. People sense when you are rooted in yourself rather than reaching for them to complete you. Chasing validation keeps you locked in reaction mode. You anticipate responses before you express yourself. You soften your boundaries to avoid disapproval. You overextend to secure appreciation. You tolerate being overlooked just to stay included. You become skilled at reading rooms but disconnected from reading yourself. The hunger for validation makes you loud in the wrong ways and silent in the right ones. It teaches you to trade authenticity for acceptance and depth for likability. When you finally stop chasing it, there is an initial discomfort because the noise drops. The quick hits of reassurance disappear. The mirrors you once used to see yourself go dark. And in that silence, you are left with your own reflection for the first time without filters. That is where real worth is built, not in being chosen repeatedly by others, but in choosing yourself when no one is clapping. As you detach from the need to be approved of, your decisions slow down. You no longer rush to impress. You no longer rush to agree. You no longer rush to be understood. You begin moving from principle instead of popularity, from values instead of visibility, from self-trust instead of social permission. And people do not always respond immediately with praise when this happens. Some misunderstand your shift as distance. Some feel uncomfortable because your independence reflects their dependence. Some step away because your lack of need exposes the imbalance. But those who recognize grounded self-worth feel its gravity. They sense that you are no longer trying to extract significance from interaction. You are bringing it with you. Your presence becomes lighter, not because you care less, but because you are no longer carrying the weight of needing to be confirmed. You begin attracting respect without requesting it because you are no longer advertising insecurity through constant proof-seeking. Your worth rises not through demand, but through embodiment, not through persuasion, but through consistency, not through noise, but through rootedness, not through approval, but through alignment with who you are when no one is watching and no one is validating and no one is choosing you in that moment except yourself.